Today, my guest and I dive headlong into how Gamemasters can tell better stories.
Welcome to DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. Level up your RPG campaigns by filling yourself with stories and knowledge. Explore topics from archaeology to film history to writing to literature and much, much more. This is DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show.
Welcome to the show. My name is Matt and I am your host. This is the show where we learn how to be better game masters and better role players by filling ourselves with stories and knowledge. My guest today is a role player and the host of a podcast focusing on storytelling. So we are just going to dive right in to today's episode. My guest today is the host of the fictitious podcast, Adron Buske. Adron, welcome to the show.
Hey, Matt, nice to be on here with you.
Can you just describe the premise of the fictitious podcast for us?
Sure. Fictitious is a podcast about the storytelling craft of science fiction and fantasy. So on every episode of the show, I have authors and other professional writers who come on, and basically what we do is we dissect their most recent release to basically get the nuts and bolts of what the story is. So we dive deep into their plotting methods, their world building, their characters, and their themes, so that we can really find out what makes their story tick, what the origins of those ideas were and how they developed over time, how they might have changed in the editorial process or through drafts, and basically just in general, just kind of find out how the soup is made. For me, as a reader and a storyteller myself, it's really fascinating to talk to writers and really just like find out why they do what they do and how they approach it and how different it is for each one of them. I mean, there's some universal truths that seem to kind of happen a lot in those interviews, but also just wildly divergent approaches to storytelling and character creation and world building, which I find really, really fascinating. So yeah, that's what Fictitious is all about.
Okay. Now, of course, my audience is geared toward tabletop role-playing games. Do you play tabletop role-playing games?
Oh, yes. Yeah. So currently I've been a part of a Pathfinder group for, I think we're just a little over 2 years at this point. We've actually been playing Rise of the Rune Lords, which if anybody plays Pathfinder, they're probably familiar with that as one of the big story campaign tracks that Paizo put out. But I've been, I mean, is this the part of the interview where everybody tells their grand role-playing adventure?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I got started in high school playing AD&D 2nd edition, back in the joyful era of THAC0 and all that kind of stuff.
Oh, yeah.
And with my high school gaming group, so we played D&D, but we also played a lot of the Palladium games. So things like Rifts and Heroes Unlimited, and a little bit of some of the other games that were related to it. And then when I got off into college, there was a long stretch between early college and then right afterwards where I kind of didn't get to play anything for a while. But then I jumped back in with D&D 3rd edition and 3.5. I did play a little bit of World of Darkness and stuff, the kind of werewolf and vampire, but that was never really my scene. I don't really I think those books are incredible. They're amazingly written and they're fascinating to read, but I don't like that system at all. But yeah, so we played 3.5 for quite a while. And then that kind of went dormant for a long stretch of time too. And then just, in the last couple of years, jumped back into playing in Pathfinder. And I would say here, I actually, at the time of this recording, last night, I literally ordered the D&D 5th edition box set with the 3 core books and the DM screen and stuff. And I did that primarily because I like Pathfinder because of this infinite amount of ways that you can customize these characters and do some really interesting things. But oh my God, system is so math and mechanic oriented. And having played that for a couple of years now, my game group is awesome, and they're all people that I've known for years, and it's a great social excuse for all of us to get together with busy schedules and stuff to get on a regimented every 2 weeks we play together. But there are long sessions, sometimes entire game sessions that are just rolling, just dice and mechanics and math and working off spreadsheets. And I have my character is a Shawanti ranger who's focused on archery, and I have to have a spreadsheet of all of my different attacks, and the different things I can apply to them and how that interacts with like my favorite enemies and stuff. And I am not a number guy. I am definitely a story and, a focused person. And so, when it comes to all those mechanics and stuff, like I can really get underwater if I don't have charts and stuff in front of me. So just to be able to play my character on a regular basis, and I'm the most like straightforward martial character in the group, probably, other than like our heavy fighter. But I really have to have that stuff in front of me or I have no idea what's going on. And that Pathfinder in general, and I haven't played the 2nd edition yet, so I don't know how it feels. But in general, I'm really looking at maybe jumping back into 5th edition and seeing how that works and seeing if that would be a good alternative as far as, playing something that's a little bit more ROLE playing focused, more so than ROLL focused. If you get me.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, certainly 5e does that. I mean, there's still rules and there's still mechanics, but yes, it's not Pathfinder. But there's always, I guess, I don't know if somebody could solve it. I guess there would be, they would be rich or whatever. But if you could solve the, tons of options to make exactly the type of character you want. Without, some of the math or something like that, like I said, you'd be rich. But there's always seems to be a tension between, more rules, more customization, whereas less rules, less customization.
Yeah, in the last couple of years, I should say like the last 6 months or so, I've really been trying to figure out what I would like to game master. And I used to GM quite a lot back in the day. I used to game master the Palladium Heroes Unlimited system, which is also, if anybody's ever played that before, I mean, it was sort of D20 ahead of D20. And it's a complicated system and a lot of stuff, and particularly introducing superpowers. I mean, the physics and things get they get wacky. They're crazy. Yeah. But I did that, and I did some D&D back in the day, although not a terrible lot of that. And as a game master, well, I guess now I think about it, I did run 3.5 for a while, but I actually had a co-game master with me who is my GM now for the Pathfinder game, because he's just way better at numbers and mechanics than I am. And so when we would co-game master, it was great because he could sort of crunch the numbers and make sure that the technical side of it worked, whereas I could focus on storytelling. And so we had really rich, vivid adventures with our group because we had that ability. And then it was nice too because sometimes we could split up the group and literally take them into different rooms and have things happen simultaneously and bring them together. And it made the process of creating those stories really fun because I had a collaborator to sit down and work through stuff with. So I did really appreciate that. But that's why, I'm looking for something where when I GM it on my own that I'm not drowning in mechanics. But in recent years, I've really been trying to look at not necessarily just fantasy-based systems, because I really like stuff like Cthulhu and things that are more, in that sort of like supernatural, X-Files, dark atmospheric, maybe urban fantasy, but not urban fantasy to the degree of, like I said, like vampire and werewolf and stuff like that. So that's not really my jam. Feels a little tropey. And so I've looked into things like Monster of the Week, which is I forget what it's something, the Apocalypse.
Yeah, Powered by the Apocalypse.
Powered by the Apocalypse, yeah, that system. And I think that system's kind of neat. Monster of the Week is kind of a fun read. Their whole system with moves is a curious way to kind of handle, how you do stuff within the game. To me, it feels really limited, and it feels like there's like huge holes in it. But I could see how it could make it run pretty quick and smoothly. I've also been reading up on the Gumshoe system. And I think there one of the, and I had not heard of Gumshoe before until I did an interview with a writer named Gareth Ryder Hanrahan. Yeah. Who people who are familiar with with gaming books might recognize him as a pretty prolific RPG writer. He wrote a terrific novel called The Gutter Prayer that came out earlier this year. Earlier this year from Orbit Books. And that's if you're an avid fantasy fan looking for something that takes a unique twist on fantasy, go pick up The Gutter Prayer. It's really, really cool. But Gareth is so good at setting up world building and storytelling within RPGs. And he was the one who had recommended Gumshoe to me, and this kind of unique set of like character settings and worlds and methodologies within that. And so I'm not as deep into reading that yet as I would like to be, but I kind of expect that Gumshoe is a direction I'll be going, because the mechanics of that one seem like very cool. Have you ever played that one, or Monster of the Week, or any of those?
No, I've read Gumshoe. And I read Trail of Cthulhu, which is basically Call of Cthulhu, but with the Gumshoe system.
Right. Yeah.
But I haven't been able to play them. And then Monster of the Week I've only heard about, and I have not looked into that one at all. But yeah, you were mentioning Palladium Games Heroes Unlimited. I think that's I spent a number of years trying to play that as well, and I think that illustrates the point that I was trying to make earlier too. Is just that you can do anything with your superhero. You could have any power, you can have anything, but then the system just held you back. We're looking at a tension between those things. I don't know what the best solution is for that, but it is interesting to hear that you are kind of looking into some of these games as well. That certainly seems to be the direction of the industry, except for Pathfinder, although I hear Pathfinder 2nd edition kind of goes this way as well, is that everybody's trying to put the story first and foremost, kind of right out there in front. I think it's interesting that you interview authors and you also tell stories through games. What have you learned about storytelling from interviewing so many authors?
Well, so, and I think this will relate to something you were saying a minute ago, because I want to backtrack just a moment on here, where there's a phrase that I saw somebody reference on Instagram the other day that I thought was pretty curious, which they called the Mercer effect. Have you heard this?
Yeah.
So if anybody hasn't heard it, like the Mercer effect is essentially referring to Matt Mercer, who's part of the Critical Role thing. And when they talk about like the Mercer effect and sort of the broader effect of Critical Role and all of those, I don't know categorically what they're called as far as like people who do role-playing games and record them and put them
actual play.
Is that what it's called? Actual play?
Actual play. Yep.
Okay. Because I always want to call it live play, and then like that's really like more like Twitch and video game streamers. But yeah, actual play. Mm-hmm. So the effect of those has on the industry and on a pop culture awareness of role-playing games has been enormous. You've seen this huge influx of people into D&D and into role-playing in general, and a lot of returned focus from people who were like, oh, I played that in high school. Also, I mean, clearly, like Stranger Things, I think, opened that up in a pop culture way where a lot of people didn't really have a clue of what D&D was before they saw the kids play that in first season. And I think all of that is really helpful. The turnaround is the Mercer effect, which is that you have a lot of people who are jumping into playing in games for the first time, and they have this preconceived idea of what it is to sit down at a table and play a game because they've seen Matt Mercer do it. And so they've seen somebody who is entrenched in the mechanics, understands the story, is immensely entertaining, can voice a bunch of different characters, just an exceptional game master. And then they might go and join a new group or sit down with their friends and try it and discover that nobody is as good as Matthew Mercer, right? Like, and that's going to be a challenge for a lot of people because they're going in expecting, rainbows and unicorns the first time that they play a game, and instead they're getting something that's a lot more utilitarian, or a game master who's just learning, and the experience isn't what they're looking for. It's not what they expected, and I think like tempering people's expectations and realizing that like that kind of game master is 1 in 1,000. They are out there, and I've had amazing game masters who build incredible worlds. But it is a skill, and it is one that requires both practice and patience and a lot of prep. And I guess there's like that's the 3 Ps: practice and patience and prep. That wasn't intentional, but alliteration's our friend, right? And also like clearly it comes from a person who's immersed in story and storytelling and understands what that means for people playing these things. Because if you get in and just start creating things kind of by the book, you can end up with a lot of like, your classic. The characters are like, well, we're in a bar, and then somebody comes in and says, I need you to fulfill a quest. And they're like, well, I got nothing better to do, I guess. Let's go fight monsters and get loot. And and those storytelling hooks are weak, but they're the cliche for a reason, because a lot of people end up with some version of that just to kind of get a story going. It feels like sometimes like the pilot of a TV show where like you just have to get through the pilot. They're usually really weak, and unless they're geniusly written, they're just something they need to get out of the way so that the show can get going and you can start getting, relationships with those characters. Yeah. So anyway, all the way around on that, like in doing fictitious and talking to authors all the time, a thing that comes up occasionally when I'm talking to them is when they'll talk about the world building that they do for their stories. A good portion of the time, these authors are building immense amount of information and world and to a certain extent, I don't say mechanics, it's not quite the same thing, but like sort of the rules of their world. That makes sense. And a lot of it never really sees the page, or it doesn't make its way to the final version of the story, of the one that hits shelves and hits readers. And that's a good thing. I mean, all that world building that happens, it's all important for the author to know it because it informs their world and the fun of creating. But if it was all there in the eventual text, it could be exceptionally boring. It'd be too much. You'd be just hammering people over the head with it. So what they end up is having a lot of preparation that doesn't see its way to the final version, but that preparation can help them when they write sequels, or if they expand the world and with other kinds of spin-offs, or if it eventually gets optioned and they're building something bigger as a film or a TV show. But occasionally, like I've made the remarks to them where I've like, oh, well, this stuff would be really great for the eventual RPG, right? And the reaction is usually either, oh my God, oh, that would be brilliant, or it's we're totally doing that, but I can't talk about it yet. And a few of the authors that I have that I cannot say who they are, but who have some very, very cool books that are very unique, have all said, yeah, this is actually a thing that has, at the very least, has been requested of them now. And then there are some cases like there's an author named Brian McClellan who has a series called the Powder Mage Trilogy, which is a pretty unique fantasy world that also has guns and gunpowder, and the mages of that world literally like snort gunpowder like cocaine in order to do magic. And he got approached by a gaming company that said, "Hey, let's turn this into an RPG." And he was like, okay, cool. That sounds like a neat way to, evolve my IP here. And but Brian, unlike a lot of these other authors who create endless amounts of world building, Brian only creates exactly what happens on the page and nothing more. He's incredibly concise in the way that he puts his stories together. So he instead, when he went to write an RPG, he had that thought of like, cool, man, like I write insanely fast and I make story. He writes these big doorstopper books that are like 1,000 pages long, like they're massive. I don't read that kind of fantasy. I don't have that attention span anymore. But it's impressive. Like these just huge, huge volumes. And then he actually sat down to write for the for an RPG, and he found it exceptionally difficult. It was a completely different skill set for him, and he didn't have this immense backlog of world building, and so he found it far harder to create that than some authors that I've talked to who are sort of naturally creating those things on the side anyway. So he definitely like world building and stuff like that, for some people comes very naturally and it becomes the obsession. A lot of people who are trying to write their books for the first time, or even trying to create their own kind of role-playing worlds, they will get really obsessed with the world building and forget to do story. They just really want to be like, oh, here's my cool magic system, or here's the neat background, or here's the cool races, all this stuff. And they'll spend umpteen zillion hours putting those things together before they finally go, oh, I have to have a story to hang this around. Oh, I don't know what that is.
Yeah.
And I think that can be pretty dangerous, but
Now,
go ahead. Yeah. Sorry.
Oh, well, that's okay. I was just going to say, I've only interviewed several novelists so far, but I find that there is a common thread that they've all played Dungeons and Dragons or some type of role-playing game. Do you find that a number of the authors that you talk to have played role-playing games?
Oh yeah. That's we don't talk about it on the show a lot. Sure. Almost every time that we do the interviews, there ends up being like a half hour to an hour of conversation after it's over. And that's usually like, so I mean, we're not on a video call, so you can't see it. But like in my studio here, I actually have like two, like what I call my walls of nerd, which is just all the kind of memorabilia and fun stuff that I have up behind me. And partially it's just because it makes it creates visual interest, production value, if you will. Whatever I'm doing, not that the podcast ever sees any of that stuff, but it's just helpful with the interviewee. But a lot of times it just sparks conversation. And yeah, that stuff does come up a lot where we get to talking about how a lot of them have played D&D or some of those other kinds of systems. And yeah, things that come up a lot are that that they have played D&D, and also that an awful lot of the new writers also wrote fan fiction, which is a thing. When I think about it, I guess like I kind of like I don't want to say like I'm disdainful of fan fiction. I've just never been interested in it. Like it's not a thing I would ever seek out to read anybody else's writing of an IP in that way. But then when I think about it, I have like some of the first things that I wrote, like when I was a kid, were like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles comics. And I wrote, I guess, what counts as Star Wars fanfic and stuff like that. I just never thought about it that way. I was just exploring storytelling, in somebody else's sandbox. But I just never put it up anywhere, right? And it never even occurred to me to share it. It was just stuff that I did. And then, yeah, so there's a lot of these writers that have definitely explored storytelling through that. But yeah, definitely a ton of them have done particularly D&D. I mean, because it's the most widely played and recognized one. Occasionally, a few of them have admitted to having been LARPers or having played funnily enough, when anybody that I've interviewed mentions that they have done like World of Darkness or LARP as part of that, they get real sheepish about it and they don't want to talk about the particulars. They back away from that a lot. I mean, I get like LARP in its various versions definitely carries certain stigmas in certain crowds, but yeah, anyway,
there's none of that here.
None of that LARPing here.
No, I meant the stigma.
Oh, right. Yeah. I never did. I had a lot of friends who did like the World of Darkness LARPing when we were in college, but I never got into it. But I was one of those like padded weapon fighter kids when I was in high school and a little bit in college. To me, that doesn't necessarily count as LARPing because we didn't have any story around it. We were just made padded weapons and beat the hell out of each other, which was immensely entertaining for many hours. But I know that there's, it falls into like sort of like the, what do they call it? Like the Renaissance reenactment kind of groups or the Society of Creative Anachronisms and stuff like that. So, I've dabbled in all those kinds of things, but I'm not a joiner, Matt. I go my own way.
Okay, so you're alone. All right, we get it.
I'm an enormous extrovert. I'm totally not alone.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I have no particular disdain for the LARPing thing. Although, like, I just never found that I particularly interfaced well with them. But like I said, it is funny when the authors always talk about it. It always just seems to be like a chapter of their life that they've set quietly behind, and they do not publicize.
And I think, like you had mentioned, like the Mercer effect. I think the good side of that is that some of that stigma is going away. That it's not crazy people who are in some weird place playing a game. It's cool people playing fun games that are actually helpful to people and can be a ton of fun as well. And but yeah, then the double-edged sword is that if you come to my table expecting Matt Mercer, you're at the wrong table, right? I mean, but it's just it's unfortunate, I guess, that things come like that. But as long as it's getting more people into the hobby, when I hear that it's like that people are afraid to GM because they're not as good as Matt Mercer, that's when I start getting kind of upset because or a player is upset because they're like, oh, well, it doesn't feel like Critical Role when we're playing. It's just like, hey, look, this is a great hobby. We should be having fun. Everybody who's played should be able to run a campaign now and then. When I was in high school, and even now to some extent, it's like if somebody comes to me and says, hey, I'm thinking about running a campaign, I'm like, what time and when? Like, it's like, oh, they've never run a game before. It doesn't matter. It's like, oh, I get to play, amazing,
Right. Yeah.
So yeah, I guess there is some double-edged sword kind of stuff there, but I really hope that it goes the other way. It pulls to the side of bringing more people into the hobby.
Yeah, and and I think also when you talk about the Mercer effect, there's that feeling, oh, well, the Game Master isn't as good as Mercer. I'm like, well, also the people that all play those games, they're all like voice actors and improv people and comedians and stuff. So they're all funny, they're all entertaining, and your particular game group may or may not lean that way. my group that I play Pathfinder with is a very entertaining bunch. And so, we get all the best quips and entertaining lines and character interactions and funky voices and stuff because we're all nerdy like that, and we all have theater backgrounds, and we have that kind of rapport with each other where we can go there and not feel self-conscious about it. But if you get together with a new group, and you're new to it, and you've got one person who's like, I shall verily slay this dragon with my paladin-y sword of goodness. And you're over there and you're like, I've never done this before, and I don't have a character voice, or I don't know how to overdo it. It's balancing that stuff out is really challenging, both from the standpoint of getting the right player group and having a game master. And I feel like I'm also a musician, and I always felt like putting bands together back in the day, like the hardest thing to find was like a good drummer, like because finding the person who has all the tools and has the whole kit and can play and whatever is really tough. Finding a good game master is a lot like that, finding like because everybody wants to play, but not enough people want a game master because it's a lot of work. They want to slay the dragon, they don't want to be the dragon that gets slain. So but yeah, I mean, I want to, and I feel like I've been kind of dancing around the idea of like story and this stuff goes together. But where I think about what we talk about in fictitious and in game mastering and role playing in general, is when I think about what game masters are missing when they come to the table with this stuff, it is that a lot of them are missing a real understanding of story, and because I think when people come to play an RPG, and maybe this has changed a little bit in the era of like big AAA role playing or AAA video games and stuff. But at least back in the day when I first got into it, the idea was that you were essentially like, it was like taking your favorite novel, your favorite fantasy world, and then you got to be one of the people swinging a sword in it. And so, part of that was like, cool, I'm going to vanquish bad guys, I'm going to take out goblins and stuff. But a lot of it was just being a part of that adventure, being that character, living that existence. And I think sometimes it's real easy from a game master standpoint to get real hung up on, what are the challenge ratings and how many encounters do I put in here? And, like, how do I, deliver the right kind of like treasure and stuff to them? And it's this very kind of workman-like approach to setting up a role-playing game where, each encounter, like, it has to escalate. There's got to be X number of times where they roll the dice in order to fight the way through stuff. And, the bigger and badder tough guys, all that stuff. And it all makes sense. It's in the mechanics of the game. It's important for it to a degree. But I think that understanding what makes great story, and both in a novel, in a film, and in role-playing is really important. And I think that's something that it would really behoove a lot of people who are interested in game mastering or have been game mastering for a long time to like really dive into. Because I think then they're going to have a much better ability to give colorful information about the world and the world building, that makes it more fun for the player characters, makes it more fun for the game master. I mean, also because it has to be fun for you too. And it'll make it possible for the characters to have like choices that feel organic and not so much like they're on a rail. And it also helps color, like, making NPCs that the player characters actually care about, because I feel like sometimes there's this like, oh, here's an NPC who's been around a bunch of times, and now they're supposed to matter to you, but they don't really have any character, and the player characters don't actually care about them. They're just somebody who's there that they've heard their name enough that they remember it. That's not the same as caring. And that can be tough when an adventure hook is wrapped around a character like that, where the player characters feel like it's compulsory for them to follow up on that particular story thread, even if the characters themselves don't really care. And also it's just really helpful from the standpoint of creating mystery and plot hooks. If you read widely and you find out what the nuts and bolts of storytelling is, you'll have a much better understanding of what it means to create mystery and suspense, and what it means to create story hooks that the player characters are going to want to follow up on, rather than it being the like, well, somebody walks up and says, I have a mission for you. And you're like, okay, cool. I guess that's what we do. Now we take this mission and do this thing.
And it's funny you mentioned that. I recently published a book called The No Prep Game Master. And one of my key points in that book is to fill yourself with stories, or that's what I call it. And it is to read widely and as much as you can, watch as many movies as you can, watch as many TV shows as you can. And it's fun homework, right? It's not like that is a drudgery or anything like this. It should be a fun, interesting thing. And that when you have kind of those ideas, even if you don't remember the plot of this one novel you read like exactly, or you kind of forget all the, a few of the characters' names after you read it, a couple years ago or something like that. Some of those ideas, some of those concepts stay with us, and we're able to draw on those at the table. So kind of my approach that I talk about in the book is that, if you're reading widely and you're, watching a lot of films, that you don't necessarily have to write out some kind of long document and then bring it to the table. You can just sit down at the table and you can hear things and use things that the players say, and you can just react to that in creative ways because you have read so many stories.
Yeah, it gives you a strong sense of the fundamentals of story and of character, and also just kind of understanding that as a game master, part of your job is improv, right? Like, it's being able to react in the moment to what the characters say. And if there's something that's frustrating for players, it's when you have a game master who has a story in mind that they're trying to tell, and they don't really care that much about what the choices the players are making. They just want to tell that story. Oh, yeah. And I think anybody who's played for a really long period of time will eventually run into a game master that's like that, that's going to shoehorn you into the path of whatever tale they're trying to tell, rather than let you make your own choices. And those are incredibly frustrating games to be a part of. And if the game master is still good at what they do, it can still be entertaining, and you might go along for the ride if you're, the kind of sort that is amiable to that type of coercion. As I've said, I'm not a joiner in that way, so I can be a little contentious when I run into that kind of thing. I am not an argumentative player per se, but I definitely am not shy about expressing when I feel like something's going off the rails, or if the wheels are coming off in a way, because especially so I'm 42 and involved in half a dozen side hustles and have a family, and we're all like, especially as we hit certain stages of adults, we're all busy, right? Yeah. So for me, the time of being able to have like a D&D group that met twice a week and played all the time is just not existent these days. Yeah. And as much fun as that sounds like it would be, it just doesn't work. And so when I do get to play, like, it needs to be a really good use of time, and that comes from everybody in the group. Like, you all have to be respectful of, like, this is time that you're sharing together. This is time that you could be doing any of a dozen other things. And so you're trying to be social, which I think is a huge part of the RPG experience. And occasionally people will get on the case of, like, there needs to be less talking. We need to play. Like, well, the point of this is we all get together and have a good time, right? That's the first and foremost thing. Well, the second thing is that it should be a fun story. And it shouldn't matter how great we rolled that night, or what awesome treasure or loot we found. It should be that we created some fun memories and had something to talk about after the fact, and that we want to come back and do it again. Yeah. And so I think that's where, like, that understanding of story is really important. And I have a couple of book recommendations outside of the RPG world that I think would be really helpful for GMs to read.
Okay. Could you just hold them for a second?
Sure.
Because I was just going to say, I'm in, I guess, a similar kind of situation where if I have 3 hours to play in the week, that is cut out of my family's time. That is cut out of everything. And it's just like, maybe when I was 15, I could spend 2 or 3 nights before my friends came over thinking of what I was going to run, but that just doesn't happen anymore, And so I think it is important, if people want to keep gaming as their lives change, as their families grow, and they have jobs and careers and things like this, that it's important to understand that it's like, you don't have to spend 6 nights of the week writing out what you're going to play. just to play it, on one night with your friends. It's just like, because that's impossible. Then nobody would play. So, I want people to realize that it's like, oh, okay, the character, the player can bring their character sheet to the game, and I can sit down 5 minutes before we start and maybe think of an encounter or something like that, and still have a great time, because I know how to tell a story as my characters are doing things and as my NPCs are doing things in the world. I know how to tell that story.
Yeah, I definitely I agree with that, but I would definitely say that is probably also the product of having done it for a long time. Well, sure. Like having that ability to be able to, like, on the fly. Like, I'm a good on the fly person. I can make things up as I go. I get that kind of brain. That is definitely not everybody's strong suit. And like I said, I can't handle math. So like if it comes, it's time for the mechanics and the math portion, I'm screwed. I can't do that, but I can make up story on the fly. But yeah, like, I mean, 100% that, like, finding that time to create huge things. I mean, if that's your thing and that's your one big pursuit, or, I mean, the handful of people that are actually getting paid to be GMs now, because that's a thing.
Yeah.
Like that, if that's part of like how you make it's your side hustle or livelihood.
If you're getting paid, you should prepare. Yeah, sure.
Right. Yeah. But also, that's why there's, such a wealth of campaign modules and stories that you can go get, and things that like for me, like I have this backlog, like every once in a while, like, you're familiar with Humble Bundle? Yeah. So like Humble Bundle every once in a while will put out like just some like smaller publisher will be like, hey, here's like 30 of our books with like modules of stuff for $18 or something. I mean, Paizo's done it before too. Like I have almost like the entire Pathfinder 1.0 version, but and basically right before 2.0 was coming out, they just dumped all of it into a Humble Bundle for like $20, which is cool. So I have like just this huge backlog of stuff there. But a lot of those like smaller publisher things, they're neat because they're little bits and pieces of story and ideas I can read through, at my leisure, and then go, oh, cool, there's a hook there. Here's something I can just kind of sketch down and be like, if I need a thing, I've got this sitting in my back pocket. I don't need to follow it 100%. I don't need it what they wrote to fit exactly into my world. I can make it up on the fly, but I have it there in my back pocket. And I think a lot of what your books have, like with your random tables and some of those like the quest book, because I just bought that from you at Archon like a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, thank you.
And a lot of that stuff, like that, I think that's really cool because that allows a game master who doesn't necessarily have the time, or has a group that doesn't want to live on the rail, right? That wants to try some new stuff, or just wants to take where the role playing goes. And you can have that openness to be like, I don't know, whatever you guys want to do. And they're like, let's do this. And you're like, cool, I can figure it out. Whether I can come up with off the top of my head, or I've got a random, table I can pull off and come up with. It's there. Having that kind of flexibility is certainly massive. But again, it still helps to understand what story is and where it's going, because long term, like one-off sessions like that where you just kind of do whatever are cool. But if you're doing a long campaign, if there's not overarching plot, if there's not something that's driving the story, and if there isn't character hooks that keep the PCs involved and excited about it, like eventually people will go, well, this is really cool, but like I have video games, or any of other things that I can do. So it's like there still has to be some thinking behind it.
You get better at it with experience, certainly. If you're, the more I've played, the better I am at not preparing, certainly, because I think you get to know role players. You get to know, not only do you get to know story, but you get to know role players. You get to know, since I played a lot and enjoyed them, I pretty much know what's going to make somebody excited. I know what's going to, do that. So it's kind of, I guess it's easier for me in that sense, but that's why I create some of the resources that I do. It's so that somebody else can take those and then learn how to do that. Because, even published adventures, because actually right now I took we took a break from kind of this big campaign that I had been running for a while. And I decided to run Curse of Strahd for my guys. And it requires so much prep. I have to read the thing, and it's just, just constantly, like, I don't even know what's going to happen because somebody else is telling me what's happening. So it's just like kind of the improv way of, I say not preparing, like, in some sense, I mean, just think about it. Don't necessarily, while you're cutting the grass or taking a shower or something, you don't have to write anything down. if I introduce a town to my game group right there and I just made up the town and I just throw it in front of them and they enter the town, well, I'm not worried where they go because I know everything. I'm going to make it up. Now, if my guys are going to enter a town in Curse of Strahd, I'm a little worried because I've read the book, but man, I don't remember what happens in this town, and I've got to find time to do that before the session starts. So yeah, I think obviously we all have our different styles and everything, but my thing is I just never want to hear somebody say, "Oh, the Game Master's too much work." I just want them to know that they can have fun, and but you do have to know some things, and some experience, of course, is important.
Yeah, I would say like that same problem you have with Curse of Strahd is a lot like our GM for Rise of the Rune Lords. Like I know he puts in, and his wife helps him with it too. She basically co-DMs, and like they put in a lot of work to read that stuff and keep up on it. And several of the settings that take place in that particular game are massive. I mean, huge cities, lots of stuff, big maps, and they're pretty central to the story. They do a lot of like urban exploration and combat and mystery and stuff like that. And the benefit I think that I see in there is that I would say that like my DM for that game is he's not like a natural born storyteller. Like that's not like his, like calling in life. He is definitely much more of a numbers and mechanic. In fact, in college we called them numbers. And so he's
explains Pathfinder. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So he can keep track mentally of all of that stuff. But for him, having that booked adventure is enormously helpful because it does a lot of that thinking. Now it's funny that the best characters in that game of the NPCs are the ones that he invented himself and inserted into the game.
Yeah, well, there you go.
Like they're the ones that have the most fun, like characterizations and things. So the stuff that he's inserted, the ones that we find most memorable, definitely came right from him. So, so there was times where I think as a game group we buck against the actual system itself or the campaign itself, where we get a little frustrated with it because it's. Like that particular one, like Rune Lords, I mean, it feels like it's very designed for a group of, you're supposed to be 20-year-old adventurers who are just throwing themselves into the fight. And we're guys in our early 40s who are much more interested in not dying. So we don't care as much about the glory as we do bottlenecking bad guys into a space where we can pick them off easily and give the least opportunity for us to get smashed. So at times our GM will be like, "Oh gosh, you guys are so frustrating because you're always pushing the bad guys to operate in ways that the book doesn't really like want it to go." And we're like, "Cool, that's our thing, man. We're #team not dead. That's our whole shtick." But yeah, so I mean, I think that you're going to have a lot of different types of people who GM, and figuring out where their strengths lie and what they need. Like it sounds like you are very good off the cuff, and might actually have better sessions because of that. Other people are not good off the cuff, and you can feel that lack of prep. So I think it's figuring out like what you do best. Yeah. But I do like that you mentioned kind of knowing what your players want and need. Because if there's something too that I recognize a lot as a player, it's that like everybody in the group has kind of different needs and different kind of levels of patience. Mm-hmm. And so like even with my group, and again, these are guys that I've known for 20 years. Like, we've got one guy who is very much like, he's there for the role playing. He doesn't like the combat's fun and everything, but like he recently changed his character. Like 2 years in, he had this incredibly fantastic rogue who just like so much fun, like so much character. He removed from the game because the adventure path we were on just didn't work for his character class. Like he was there to do nuance and role playing and influencing people and stuff and political machinations and whatever. And that particular campaign path just it benefits people who splat things. Mm-hmm. And so he returned to the game with a completely revised, like totally broken barbarian character who can just deal massive amounts of damage. In our last session, he took out a dragon like with 153 hit point hit. And it was fantastic. And it was really good because I was about to get burninated. But he had to change that up to something that felt like he could still have fun with it because the previous character wasn't working in it. you're going to have some players who are happy enough to kind of just go along with the story and go where it goes. You have other people who are going to really, really rankle with any type of restriction put on them, and they're going to want to just float around and do whatever. And then I think most players are going to kind of sit somewhere in between, where they want to hit stuff. They want cool character interactions. They want a balance of it. And if the balance gets really off in one direction or another, they're gonna get frustrated. And like I said, I mean, I've got a group that's been playing together for 2 years now, which has been awesome. But I've had so many games in the past that have lasted 2 or 3 sessions before people just kind of, went their separate ways, or the GM was just like, I don't have time to do this anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, now, I guess we mentioned it a couple times, but I know you said that it's important for the game master to have an understanding of story. Could you kind of explain like what you mean by that, like some key elements maybe of stories, and then you can also share your book recommendations?
Yeah. So I'm a visual thinker. I've got a background in graphic design and UX design and stuff like that. And so when I think about anything, a lot of times I've got a visual component. And so I think a lot about the shape of story. And I think about like when you read a novel, I think most people understand what a plot is, right? Like they understand like there are, whether it's like there's 3 acts and, there's a beginning, middle, and end, and what you do at the beginning has to get you to the end. And if you feel like the plot doesn't exist, then the story doesn't mean anything. Like it's not, and people will say sometimes like, oh, the plot's muddled, nothing works. You've watched a bad movie or read a book that doesn't go anywhere. And versus like if you've got a story where the plot's really strong, it's almost invisible. You just like the inevitability of the things that are happening on screen or in the book just tug you along, and it's like at a breathless pace, and you get to the end and you're just like, oh my God, I can't imagine that having gone any other way, because it's just pieced together so perfectly. And occasionally you also run into things like, are you familiar with the phrase plot armor?
No, not offhand.
So plot armor is a thing where in a story where a character that just needs to stick around for a long time for the writer's purpose becomes mildly invincible for a while. Maybe not that they're like incredible at fighting or whatever, but the plot basically stands in their way and keeps them from dying. Over and over again. And that's plot armor. Okay. And plot armor is fine until it becomes super visible. And I think that if you watch like a Game of Thrones even, or something, like you'll have long stretches where like, okay, sooner or later that character should have died. They only continue to be in the story because the author likes them, or they're necessary for the plot, even if it doesn't make sense for them to have gotten through a lot of the stuff that they had. And that's plot armor. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of times in RPGs, like there's a certain level of plot armor that gets applied to the bad guys, where there's a lot of cheap escapes where like, oh, we've met the villain and we fought him and we should have killed him, but at the last minute something happened and he got out. And that can be good for building a hook and making the characters really, really want to get the villain and take him out. But it can feel real cheap. Right? Yeah. Like, I mean, if you've ever played a session where that's happened and just at the last minute that character manages to conveniently make a saving throw that they definitely did not, and and then sneak to the back of the room and pull a lever and disappear, whatever, that's
I think that happened in most like movies from the 1970s and 80s and cartoons and things from that as well.
Oh yes, it's so tropey. Yeah. Absolutely, and it's infuriating, from the standpoint of the player, and to a reader sometimes too. And that fury can be good if it's designed well, but it can also just feel like the game master didn't allow something that happened that should have, if the characters clearly overwhelmed the bad guy, where you're like, this is supposed to be my big bad and they kicked his ass. Dude, then let that guy die and figure out something else. It's okay. You can always build like, oh, he was just the lackey for a much bigger dude. That's easy to do, right? Like, just build a hook into the next thing. But yeah, I mean, I think it really, when you look at bigger campaigns, understanding what makes a great novel or makes a great film work is understanding that like it's not just a series of beats from the standpoint of we go to town, we talk to people in town, we beat up bad guys, we come back, town celebrates, we go to the next town. That's fine for a little bit, but it's not a plot. It's just a series of events.
Yeah.
And so when you get into like the better like campaign modules and stuff where they build on them, they're, like I said, like a Curse of Strahd or a Rise of the Rune Lords, they're really building you towards like bigger things and trying to give you story hooks. So when you're creating your own, and you're trying to go long term, the effect of understanding story and understanding what those beats should be is that your players will stay interested, that they will want to know what's coming up next, and that the PCs are going to be invested in the things that are going on. And so, like what I was talking about, as far as like books that I recommend people take a look at, there's just two of them that I would throw out there. And they're short books and they're fast reads and they're very entertaining, I think, anyway. But I'm obsessed with story, so I'm going to be entertained. I don't know what it'll be like for the normal person. But one of them is called Save the Cat.
Oh yeah.
It's by a writer named Blake Snyder. And Save the Cat, it's actually been out for a number of years. The original book is all about screenplay writing. There's a newer one that came out from a different writer recently because Blake Snyder passed away a couple of years ago. But there's one called Save the Cat Writes a Novel, which is also really great. But Save the Cat, the original one, is a little bit more concise. And because it focuses on movies, it's going to hit the stuff that kind of everybody will be more familiar with. But the Save the Cat, what it does is it lines out like a 15-beat system that explains the way almost every popular film works. And while it feels like a formula, and that can sound really cliche and lame, it's actually it's no more formulaic than a 3-act structure or the 6-act structure of a TV episode or something like that. It much more kind of gives you a fundamental understanding of why story works, and how to keep a momentum going, and how to figure out what kind of themes you're doing in a story. And I think that when we game master games, we get real focused on the challenge ratings and what bad guys we're throwing against them, whatever. But we're maybe not asking like what kind of character growth is happening for these characters, other than just they're leveling up. They're like, well, I beat up enough guys, and now I'm tougher than I was before, and I can hit harder, and I have a cool new swing or something. That's all neat. That's not character growth. That's still mechanic. So, and I think that's the thing that can ring really hollow in a role-playing game after a while, if the character is evolving in the numbers, but they're not evolving as a person. And so if you want to have stories that resonate, that people want to tell their friends about later on, they should have a character growth as well. And so that's where I think something like Save the Cat is really great, because if you read that and get a sense of what the shape of a long-term story is and what you're leading to, and really when I talk about thematics, that seems like really huge and highfalutin and like college creative writing class kinds of stuff. But really, there's kind of only like 10 themes for all of humanity, for every story, because most of humanity's like foibles and troubles are pretty like, I don't know, they transfer pretty well from one thing to another. And Save the Cat boils that down really, really simply. And so having a thing where you can sit down with those 15 beats and say, oh, here's what I want to do with my overarching story. Even if I don't want to, like you said, like you don't want to spend like hours and hours and hours that you don't have and you're not getting paid for to do. Having a simple framework that lets you have an idea of where you want to go and how you want to build and maybe where you want to get to eventually. I think that's really, really valuable. And that book is so accessible and such an easy read. And it also, if you're a game master, you should have an interest in storytelling. And what Blake Snyder's Save the Cat will do is mean that every movie you watch afterwards, you will start to figure out the beats and understand like the nuts and bolts of what those stories are. And when you understand that, then those stories will make more sense to you from a mechanic level, and you can apply those ideas again to your own stuff. So I think that's super valuable. And that book's like real popular and real available all over the place. The other one is a little more obscure, but you can find it on Amazon. It's called Take Off Your Pants. And the reference in the title is that in the writing circles, they're often referred to as outliners and pantsers. Yeah. And pantsers are basically what you are when you're talking about like improving your game. You're doing it by the seat of your pants, rather than sitting down and outlining and scoping something out. So Libby Hawker's Take Off Your Pants is a book that's really designed to help you figure out how to outline in a way that's like quick and fun and makes story move. And the particular takeaway that I love in there, and again, I go back to this, the visual thinking that I was talking about, is she has this thing she talks about, which is the triangle method, which is that if you think about an upside down triangle and think about, so like the wide edge is on top and the pointy edge is on the bottom. If every scene, and let's take it from the standpoint of an RPG, like every session, like starts off wide. So when the characters come into a space, they've got lots of options. They've got lots of different directions they could go. They have it's a world of possibilities in front of them, right? But by the time they get to the end of that scene, all of those things should be narrowing down. So every choice they make brings them to a level of inevitability on it where then there's a problem they have to solve. And so if you think about every scene that you're going into, every time they come to a new place, every new story juncture, it opens wide with possibility and then leads to that inevitability. What you'll create is a sense of momentum, so that like every time they go into something, that the urgency kicks up, and by the end of it, they'll feel like every choice that we made along the way brought us to this point where there is no choice but to solve this problem or fix this thing. And if you have a problem of things feeling like they're on the rail, like you're feeling too much like the story is glued to, this one thing you're trying to tell, and the players are just kind of being dragged along, you can hide that to a certain extent using this triangle system, because basically what you'll do is you'll give them lots of options, but you will funnel them into the place where you want it to go. And if you do it right, what you'll do is construct a story that feels inevitable in the good way, in the sense that that's where the momentum took you, and not in the, well, we had to cram you into a direction to make this work. And so I think that book is, again, it's short, it's very, very readable, it's very eye-opening for the way story is created, and just giving you that kind of visual reference for how you can build out how you want your story to go. I think it's really, really useful. So that one's really good.
No, those are some great insights and some great recommendations. I think too that I guess we kind of alluded to it earlier. There's also the need for failure. The characters need to fail at some point so that they can really just tap into, the players can tap into their ingenuity and their resourcefulness instead of just kind of bulldozing through everything.
Yeah, you're 100% right. Because, and this is going to be tough. Like I have conversations with my GM sometime about how he will get frustrated because like our party has become very good at problem solving. And so we make it hard for him to hurt us. And I'll say to him, I'm like, from the standpoint of the player, like, we don't want to die, right? Like one of the worst things as a player character is to have your character die, because you feel like then you're like just, you spent 2 years working on something that just went up in smoke, and then you don't know what to do next. And especially like, if anybody's had that happen where you die halfway through a character session and then you're just sitting there for the rest of the time being angry, that part sucks. That's no good. So like punishing the characters, like nobody wants a TPK, right? Like, that's not the kind of failure that I think benefits the game group, unless they just act like a bunch of idiots. I certainly had a friend who used to play, like he would play every character class he played completely wrong. So if he was a monk, he was always just the first one to jump in and start some crap. Never, he couldn't play any character to type. And so he always died. He was just getting murdered left and right because he just didn't have the patience to stand around and wait a minute. And that gets real old after a while, trying to run around and get a guy resurrected just because he's your pal in real life. So eventually you stop calling that guy, right? But at least to the game sessions, after a certain point, that's just a liability. But yeah, there should be a level of ebb and fall in it, where occasionally your character should run into a thing that they can't solve by their usual methods, whatever those things are, and they have to work their way around it. And they should be challenged to do something that's maybe outside of their their normal path. Like, and so if you got a group that's a bunch of bludgeoners, they're there to just beat them up, and then they get hit with mystery where they have to investigate, you're definitely going to stretch what those characters are capable of and how they think and what their skill sets are. And that can definitely lead your game in the wrong direction if if you're trying to shoehorn them into something that they don't do well. But at the same time, it can cause them to stretch, can cause them to figure out new ways to apply themselves. And if they do fail a few times, then that's good. Just as long as, like I said, like as long as it's not the game master, finger of doom, just rubbing a character out, just be like, haha, you failed. Like, no, man. Like, don't do that. Like, just create story reasons for those things to happen, and then see if your characters can solve their way out of them.
I guess something that I've just been, obviously we're getting here a little long on time, but just something I've been thinking about recently. I've interviewed several novelists, because my podcast is new. You interview novelists. But if we're talking about role-playing games, the stories aren't written, they're oral stories. And and that's just something that kind of occurred to me fairly recently. And I'm just trying to think about that and seeing what the difference then would be, because obviously the game master can use body language as well as different, facial expressions and things to tell a story. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. It's just something that I've been thinking about recently.
Yeah. They're participatory, right? So keeping everybody involved and keeping them entertained is a big deal. As a game master, if you can develop a repertoire of both the ability to colorfully describe things, not just, oh, you hit him for 35 points and he falls, and be like, and I feel like some of the Pathfinder games will kind of tell you to be like, don't spend a lot of time saying, oh, we took an arrow to a knee or whatever like that. Yeah. But for me, like, I want that vivid description, sure. Right? Like I'm a big fan. There's an author named Joe Abercrombie, has a book called The First Law Trilogy and a bunch of other ones. And he's also a book called Best Served Cold. If you want a really great standalone fantasy novel that's just gritty, like an awesome, Best Served Cold is awesome. And his descriptions of battle and the consequences of battle and how characters feel in them is both really entertaining but super enlightening for a game master. So if you're looking at trying to find someone who's a good influence as far as figuring out how to describe things in a visceral fashion that feel real, then Abercrombie's books are a really great starting point. But yeah, like developing different voices, different, like you said, body language, different ways to convey things, and just trying to amplify the atmosphere of what you're doing. And some people will use music or they'll have granted, having a table full of figures and pawns and stuff is helpful. I have some weird feelings about that because I came up in D&D second edition when we didn't have like maps or tables or anything, so we were never. It was more theater of the mind, so we were not worrying about like, oh, do I have can I get 6 squares to get to a thing, which feels very mechanical, very board gamey rather than something that happens fluidly. And so sometimes I feel like that's a detriment to modern gaming, is that dependence on a table. Yeah. But yeah, being able to walk in and be like, creating a character immediately out of nowhere and have an accent. So when you're like, oh, the rogue steps up and he's like, I heard that you're a bunch of adventurers and that you're looking for a new member of the team. I just might have the right tools to benefit you. Being able to do something like that and bring something, to life is really, really helpful. And even if it's manic and crazy, or like you're just obviously emulating somebody else. I mean, my group has a half-orc cleric, and he is based entirely off that rock guy from Thor Ragnarok. Okay. If you know the character, I don't know. It's like he's
just a little bit, yeah.
Yeah, he's just a big, very silly. And he's like, "All right, friends, let's do the thing today." And he's a half-orc like cleric of destruction who's relentlessly upbeat and positive. And it's really, really entertaining. And the guy who plays in the group does it really, really well and does the voice much better than I did there. But yeah, having those elements so that when you do speak in a character voice, everybody knows it. And again, some of that takes practice. Some of that takes, it's not going to be everybody's cup. And everybody has a bunch of different, accents at their availability. But there's a performative aspect. And if you're going to be a game master, like all eyes are on you for some of that. And you've got to want to be able to perform and bring something, fun to the table. If you don't want to do that, I mean, that's what board games are for, right? Like you can run Talisman or something like that where you don't have to act. You can just play. But if you're going to have 4 to 6 people sitting around a table hanging on every word, you need to like be ready to describe the world, bring atmosphere, bring flavor, bring character to it, and lean on your own strengths, like figure out like what that thing is that you do best. If you do comedy best, like, man, make that game funny. Like, that's the best part of sitting around with a group of people is, playing D&D or whatever, is laughing your ass off because it's so ridiculous, or you get the best quip or whatever it is. Figure out what your game group works well with, what they seem to enjoy the most, and what you're good at, and then just, lean hard into that. But yeah, if you can add a little bit of extra improv to it, man, that it adds so much.
Adron, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the show today. We've talked about quite a number of things, and it has been fascinating. So thank you so much for being on the show. Your podcast is called Fictitious, and I will link that up to the show notes to this podcast at dicegeeks.com so everybody can check that out. So thank you very much for being on the show.
Yeah, I'm happy to join it. And I've been really appreciative of your books and stuff so far. I think as I enter my new game mastering that they're going to be really helpful for me. So I appreciate that too. Thank you so much for having me on.
Okay, guys, that wraps up today's interview. I really hope you enjoyed this conversation with Adron. As you can see, Adron takes storytelling very seriously, and I just had a blast chatting with him. Hopefully, I can get him back on the show, and we can just continue our talk about how to tell better stories. You can find show notes for this episode and all the other episodes at dicegeeks.com. If you want something for free, and I am sure that everybody wants something for free, then please head over to dicegeeks.com/free, and you will get 10 free dungeon maps, plus some other RPG resources you can use in your campaigns. And as a bonus, you will never miss an episode of this podcast. If you like this show and enjoy the interviews that I do, please consider supporting the show on Patreon. It would mean the world to me if you would just go over to patreon.com/dicegeeks and check out the different support levels there. Any support that you would give through Patreon would go to help making this show better, and just let me know that you appreciate all of the work that I put in to create these episodes. So I thank you for listening, and until next time, keep gaming.